The year was 1928. An uncovered petri dish containing the common staphylococcal bacteria was left by an open window. This simple accident would soon become a revolutionary antibiotic called penicillin, and this was all thanks to a man by the name of Alexander Fleming. However, this isn't his story. It's the story of how his groundbreaking discovery of penicillin would have the ability to treat a disease that sparked an egregious 40-year-long study known as the Tuskegee Syphilis experiment. Alexander Fleming noticed that the uncovered petri dish had begun to grow mold spores, and the mold colonies were killing the bacteria around it. From this, he isolated the mold juice and named it penicillin. This medicine could fight against many diseases such as pneumonia, gonorrhea, and meningitis. Alexander Fleming's discovery would not become sought after until the 1940s and ended up being mass-produced for World War II. Another disease that penicillin could treat was syphilis, which was the disease that launched the Tuskegee Syphilis experiment into motion. The full name for the Tuskegee Syphilis experiment was the Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male. It started in 1932 in the city of Macon County, Alabama. This experiment was held in Macon County because it had the highest syphilis rate in America at the time. Syphilis is a sexually transmitted infection that was extremely contagious, and since penicillin didn't become widely available until the 40s, it didn't have a cure. It is caused by an organism known as the Treponema pallidum and can be acquired or congenital. Acquired syphilis is usually caused by sexual intercourse, whereas congenital syphilis is passed on from an infected mother to the fetus. There are 3 stages of syphilis: primary, secondary, and tertiary. Some symptoms that occur in the primary and secondary stages are rash, indigestion, hair loss, and fever. Hearing and sight can also be lost due to the most harmful stage, the tertiary stage. Some of this stage's effects include bone deterioration, organ damage, and neurosyphilis, a variant of syphilis that travels to the brain and gradually causes the person to go insane. Scientists knew little about the details of this disease, so they decided to conduct a new experiment. The United States Public Health Service funded the Tuskegee Syphilis experiment and partnered with the Tuskegee Institute with one goal in mind: to track the full growth of syphilis in the Negro male. 600 black men were chosen for the experiment. 399 of them had latent syphilis, while 201 did not. They used what was called a Wassermann test to identify the people that had syphilis and narrow down the experiment to males that were 25 or older. If they weren't going to treat them, how would they even begin to recruit them to what would essentially be a death sentence? Simple. The beginning of this experiment took place amidst the Great Depression, and African Americans definitely suffered from America's economic state. This was due to their unemployment rates being higher than their white counterparts, and the fact that they were given less aid from public assistance programs. So, in order to persuade the men to join the experiment, the doctors offered them incentives such as free health benefits, free meals on days when they would be examined, and burial stipends for the patient's relatives. Most of these men were sharecroppers and weren't given the luxury of free medical care, so the promise of it was enticing. However, they were not informed that they even had syphilis and were simply told that they had bad blood, which was a very broad term that was used to describe lots of illnesses back then. When the experiment first began, there was no cure for syphilis, but in 1947, penicillin became the suggested medicine. Instead of being given penicillin, the patients received placebos, like iron tonic and aspirin. The study was originally only supposed to last from 6 months to a year, but Dr. Raymond Vonderlehr wanted to gather more data about the full effects of untreated syphilis over a span of many years. Since the study was simple to conduct and fairly cheap, it continued when Dr. Vonderlehr became the new director of the Division of Venereal Diseases. He basically wanted to continue the experiment until the men died, so autopsies could take place. The syphilitics who were between ages 25 to 45 when the experiment first started had a 20% lower life expectancy than the control group who were within the same age range. By the end of the experiment, it was found that more patients who had syphilis died than those who did not. 100 men had died because of syphilis-related issues, and 28 had died due to syphilis. Many of the patients' wives also contracted syphilis, and some passed it on to their children. On July 25, 1972, the news about the Tuskegee syphilis experiment was released in the Washington Star by Gene Heller of the Associated Press. This experiment was now officially out to the public, but the painful impact of it was far from over. The study came to an end 3 months after the story broke. The survivors were also given the imperative medical care, but the only legal way for that to happen was for it to be a part of the official experiment. It was hard to blame a specific person because of the longevity of the experiment, the evolution of syphilis treatment options, and because the officials who had originally started the Tuskegee study had long since retired. Surprisingly, the experiment was never kept secret, and the doctors argued that giving the patients penicillin to treat syphilis would have had more negative effects than positive ones. The main issue was that 600 men in the experiment were not treated as subjects, but as guinea pigs that could be tested to make some discovery. Rules were made for U.S. government-funded projects that do research with human subjects in order to protect the patients. Those rules should have been in place since the beginning, but not all was lost. In 1974, the surviving patients of the study and the deceased patient's heirs gained a $10 million out-of-court settlement. Despite being a victim of this cruel experiment, the final patient, Ernest Hendon, lived a long life and passed away at the age of 96 in 2004. Even though the participants received compensation, the ripple effect of this experiment can never undo the damage done. From then on, Black people's perception of public health was forever changed. The history of racism in the scientific and medical world has since caused Black people to be cautious of doctors, vaccines, and many other forms of health care. The life expectancy for Black men at age 45 has been lowered by 1.4 years. That is 3 years less than their white counterparts and 5 years less than the life expectancy of Black women. There were, of course, benefits of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment because they gained more understanding about the disease, but it was at the cost of people's lives. This study left a stain on American history, and hopefully this will influence the government to learn from its past and not repeat it. In 1997, President Bill Clinton formally apologized for the Tuskegee syphilis experiment.
We can look at you in the eye and finally say, on behalf of the American people, what the United States government did was shameful, and I am sorry.
Can you ever make an apology sufficient enough for taking people's lives? For not giving informed consent about a deadly disease, all for the sake of scientific discovery? Will claiming there were no racial biases ever tear down the box Black people are placed in because of these stereotypes?
Many in the Black community are still reluctant about getting that COVID-19 vaccine, often referencing the controversial Tuskegee experiment.
Will throwing money at the situation ever be able to fix what has been broken? Could one long overdue apology ever erase the generational mistrust of health officials that was caused by this almost half a century experiment?
If the only reason that you're not getting it is because of the Tuskegee syphilis study, then it's kind of out of context. You're kind of doing to yourself what the federal government did to those men.
Only you have the power to forgive. Your presence here shows us that you have chosen a better path than your government did so long ago. You have not withheld the power to forgive.